Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, good evening. I'm Shamsul Haris, 2218275, representing our team as well, Labour Gang for Section 1. Our topic, Labour Market Tightness and Wage Dynamics in Malaysia. We do quarterly time series analysis 2015 to 2025. Moving on, just introducing my teammates here. I'm Shamsul, there's Zaid Haritha later, Sobhani, Zaim and Megat Shabir explaining in detailed parts of every single aspect of our thesis and argument. Our whole argument basing on our objective to examine the impacts of labour market tightness on median wages in Malaysia, basing on the 44 time period of quarters from 2015 to 2025, beginning with introduction, abstract topic selection, then LR, literature review combining more than 20 journal articles, and methodology of paper and data analysis, describing the data and also analyzing the data using R software, conducting OLS regression as well. And after we analyze it, we compare with variable and also current Malaysian economic policy, we choose our policy implications and also the effect to the Malaysian economy and Malaysian labour market. In our abstract, we say that when we examine relationship between LMT, labour market tightness, and median wages, it's based on V over U ratio, vacancy over unemployment, OLS regression, and we put COVID-19 as our dummy. As a result, simply said, when we put that, LMT is not that statistically significant to median wage, but GDP and inflation are statistically significant. Why? My friend will explain later. Because there are more structural barriers to growth, such as foreign labour dependency, mismatch, and also we have policy recommendations as well. In our introduction part, we show this part between the GDP growth and median wage growth differences that. And labour market tightness using V over U ratio, higher V over U ratio means it is not easy for those who are offering jobs to seek people who wanted to get their jobs, and vice versa for lower LMT. This is our objective paper based on the theoretical foundations of Pisarides and Mortensen and Pisarides. So Sobhani, what are the articles explaining in our literature review?
Assalamualaikum. I am Sobhani Alif Mahmud, metric number 2226161, and I will be presenting the literature review section where we have converges around 4 themes. The first one is that which gives theoretical foundation for labor market tightness. Pisarides were the first, and then followed by Mortensen with him, who established the theory of labor market tightness through showing that vacancy over unemployment ratio significantly can predict and analyze the movement in wages, and then it got backed up by many other empirical findings where generally the theory means that higher vacancy over unemployment ratio creates more bargaining power for labor, therefore shifting up the wage, while the opposite happens when V over U ratio is lesser. Lastly, by Barnett-John and Shapiro in 2022 had a significant finding which suggested that V over U ratio is better than unemployment alone in explaining wage movements. However, they also found that if skills mismatch exists in the economy, it can create bias in this relation, overstate the tightness measure, and therefore can be less significant in explaining the wage movement. Next, we move to the second finding where we analyze Malaysia's economy in terms of how fit it is for labor market tightness analysis. We see that the beverage curve, which links vacancy with unemployment, holds in Malaysia, but because of skills mismatch, it is drifting outward over time. Secondly, vacancy data is often under-recorded or not properly recorded in Malaysia. Third significant finding is that skills mismatch index over time from 2007 until 2017 tripled, therefore showing a significant skills mismatch in Malaysian economy, which can create bias in labor market tightness analysis. For the third finding, we have how GDP and inflation talks in terms of explaining wage movement. We see that for growth, Okun's law, which explains the link between growth and unemployment, holds in Malaysia, with caveats explained in extent of which growth affects unemployment fluctuates. And for inflation as well, Phillips curve, which links inflation with unemployment, was found to be significantly holding in Malaysia, but it still have unstable link. However, some other findings says that high CPI almost always translate into higher wage in Malaysian context. So among literature, we can see that GDP and inflation are relevant in explaining wage movements, but the literature does not settle on to what extent GDP and inflation motivates the wage movement. Fourth finding was about COVID, and the literature highlights that COVID was the first time that distorted labor market tightness significant, and skills mismatch heightened the highest as well, matching productivity collapse, and historic highest was the median wage decline. Therefore, we can suggest that including a COVID-19 dummy in the proposed model would be way more relevant. Similar goes for GDP and inflation inclusion, and also since our main variable to be analyzed is labor market tightness, we want to see how significant is labor market tightness given the current structural mismatch index Malaysia have.
My name is Arisa Beranan, sheet number 2217403. For the methodology, the study used quantitative research design, which has quarterly data from 2015 until 2025, and the total number of observation is 44. For the sources of each variable, we extract it from the DOSM. For median wage and vacancy, we get it from statistics, unemployment and CPI from DOSM, and lastly GDP from the stats DW. And for the data preparation and cleaning, the way we cleaning it, all variable is in quarterly data, except for the CPI and median wage. CPI and median wage is available in monthly data, so we convert from the monthly data into the quarterly data. But from the median wage, it is available from year 2020 until 2035. Before 2022, the data is there, but it is in annually frequency. So the way we convert from annually data to quarterly data, we use a backcasting method to estimate quarterly values from 2015 until before 2022. When we convert from annual data to quarterly data, we maintain the consistency with the original annual average. And for the dependent variable is a median wage. The main dependent variable is labor market tightness. GDP and CPI we include in the model as a control variable to reduce the variable bias, and also it can improve our accuracy of the model. And we also include the quarterly dummies to capture the seasonality pattern, and also COVID-19 dummies to capture the shocks. And we also conducted the diagnostic test to test the heteroscedasticity, multicolority, and so on. And lastly, we do the analysis using R Studio software. And for the data preparation and cleaning, we use Microsoft Excel. For the data description, from this table, we can see that the average wage is 2.3K. For the LMT, the average is 0.37, which indicate that there were about 0.37 vacancy for every unemployed person. And from this, the highest variance is GDP variable, because the standard deviation is very high. And for the skewness, all variable, we can say that it is approximately a symmetric distribution. And lastly, for the kurtosis value, the distribution is somewhat close to the normal distribution. Next, we move to the pattern analysis. We can see that the wage, GDP, and also CPI, it shows an upward trend, while the LMT, it shows downward trend, but after pandemic, it goes upward. But the common things that we can see from all these four plots is there is economic shocks which occur because of COVID-19. So in order to capture the shocks happen, we include the COVID-19 dummies into our model. And for the seasonal pattern, we can see that the seasonal plot for wage and GDP, it shows us there is a strong seasonality in wage and GDP. For example, from GDP, the lowest is at quarter 1, and then it increased to quarter 2, quarter 3, and the highest at the peak in quarter 4. Moving to the quarter 1 next year, it goes down again, and the pattern is the same from early observation until the end. For the seasonality for CPI and LMT, it shows also the seasonality, but it is not as strong as the seasonal pattern from wage and GDP. But overall, all variable has a seasonal pattern. So in order to capture the seasonal pattern, we include the quarterly dummy in our model. And for the correlation analysis, we can see that GDP and CPI has a strong correlation, which means it gives a sign of multicollinearity issues. So at the end, we need to test whether really a multicollinearity issue or not. So our model is reliable, and also our coefficient is reliable.
My name is Ahmad Zaim, metric number 2211213. For data analysis part, there will be three components: R squared, diagnostic test, and coefficient. For the R squared, it measures the fitness of the model, how well the independent variables can explain the dependent variable. And the adjusted R squared is just R squared, but adjusted by the degrees of freedom. For the result, the R squared is 0.9665, and the adjusted R squared is 0.9599. The result suggested that the model can explain 96.65% of the independent variable. The same goes for the adjusted R squared, where the independent variables are able to explain 95.99% of the dependent variable. Because the difference between unadjusted and adjusted is very insignificant, we accept both R squared. For the diagnostic test, the first test is heteroscedasticity test. We use two tests, Bush-Pagan and White test. For Bush-Pagan and White test, the p-value for both tests are more than 0.05. In this case, we do not reject H null, which is in this case is homoscedasticity. So there is no presence of heteroscedasticity in this model. The second test is multicollinearity assessment, where we use VIF to identify the severity of the multicollinearity. The result shows CPI and GDP have 5.55 and 5.37 for the adjusted GVIF. However, we took multicollinearity more than 10. So for our model, there is no severe multicollinearity and the model is reliable. The diagnostic test is autocorrelation and misspecification test. For the first test is the Watson test, and the second is Johnbach test to identify autocorrelation across multiple labs. For the Watson, the result we obtain is 1.7089, which is near 2, indicates there is no autocorrelation. And the Johnbach test, the p-value is 0.339, which is above 0.05, which means there is no autocorrelation across multiple legs. The fourth test, normality test. We use Job-Barrel test to identify whether the residuals are normally distributed within the model. The p-value result is 0.8823, above 0.05. It passes the normality test, and all residuals are normally distributed within the model. So the next part is coefficient. So the first one is constant variable, where we equal other independent variable equal to 0. The coefficient is negative 1358. This means the median wage will fall by RM 1358 if there is no other variables. The second one is GDP, where the coefficient is 0.003361. This one is a positive coefficient, which means that the median wage will increase by RM 0.003361 for every 1 ringgit increase in GDP. The third variable is LMT, labor market tightness, which is negative 126.0. This indicates a negative relationship with the dependent variable, which means the median wage will fall by RM 126. The next variable is CPI. The coefficient is 24.41, a positive coefficient. So, for every 1 point increase in CPI, the median wage will increase by RM 24.41. For the next four variable, I will pass to Brother Bagat.
My name is Megat Syafiq Azwar bin Zulkifli. My metric number is 2212059. So, recalling the previous model, we can see that the highest wage level is being achieved in the model is actually in the Q1. So, that's why in Q2, Q3, and Q4, all of the values shows a negative coefficient value. However, we should note that during the quarter 3, wage falls the lowest by 133 ringgit and 10 cents. And also, for the dummy variable, which is the COVID-19 lockdown period, we can see that holding other variable constant, the impact of COVID-19 itself can reduce the median wage for Malaysian by 165 ringgit 50 cents. Moving on to our findings, in this part, we actually compared the findings from our empirical data and also the literature review. Recalling the regression result that we attained, the labour market tightness gave negative impact while GDP and CPI gives a positive impact. However, our finding is a bit contradicting with two of the papers in the literature review, which is by the Jamaluddin et al. 2025 and also Mortensen and Pissarides 1994 and Pissarides 1985. The contradicting result is actually due to the difference in the model where we use the regression between the wage and LMT, while Jamaluddin and Mortensen is using the beverage curve analysis and search and match modeling. So the main reason for this contradicting result is actually different cases between Malaysia and the other countries. So in the other countries, higher labour market tightness indicates a higher labour market demand, which will push the wage level into a higher level. However, for the Malaysian case, it is the contradicting, where unemployment dominates the LMT equations. So we can refer this to the wage unemployment model by Blanchflower and also 1995. The natural log of wage and also the natural log of unemployment are actually in the negative relation between each other, such that if 1% increase in unemployment will decrease the wage level by 0.1%, holding other variable as constant. However, for the GDP and the CPI, our model still follows the literature review, where the GDP uses the Ocken's law, since increment in GDP indicates a high production and also high labour demand. Since high labour demand will indicate a high employment, so it will push the wage into a higher level. Also the same for CPI, but CPI uses a bit more indirect relationship, where prices will affect the unemployment, since higher price indicates higher production, and higher production means lower unemployment. So from there, it still impact the labour demand, which also will pressure the wage level to go higher. And lastly, for the findings in the seasonality and the pandemic effect on wage, our studies and also the literature review are in line together, since both regression results shows the negative impact of seasonality and COVID. And also the same for Sect et al. 2012, where COVID-19 actually causes a cyclical trend and structural trend declining. For the Malaysian case, during the COVID-19, we had faced a structural break, as denoted by Habibullah et al. 2021 and Lim 2022, due to the changes in the business structure for a lot of firms in Malaysia. This is mainly to accommodate the changes in SOPs and also in marketing, like digital marketing. Therefore, the structural changes can be seen where incompatible and inefficient workers during that period of time will be laid off by most of these firms. Therefore, this is the part of the structural trend where the labour market tightness is affected. Even some of these workers are also being replaced by automation. If we refer back to the original LMT equation, the denominator part where the unemployment will become larger and the labour market tightness will become looser. And lastly is regarding the aggregate demand will also low during the COVID-19 period. Therefore, production reduces and it causes a cyclical declining in the aggregate demand and also the aggregate production. Therefore, there is also increment in the unemployment part, which also makes the labour market tightness worsen.
So now it is not alien to say that theory it does not match real practice. But now what happens when Malaysia government acts upon it? First, the minimum wage policy introduced by the Malaysian government always changing. They increase and increase and increase, but it doesn't solve the root cause of the problem, which is the unemployment itself, as stated by our studies, dominated the LMT equation. So first one, we need to reform this minimum wage policy by a multi-stakeholder market responsive wage framework. Market reacts and we can respond upon it. And we need to have VU ratio based LMT indicators alongside CPI and productivity in our wage and labour market benchmark, not just wages only in Malaysia. And also pushing for progressive wage policy with our regulatory sandbox to test it to promote high growth, high value job opportunities. We need to make it better. Second, we have skill mismatch, as said by our brother before. So how to do that, how to solve it? Do reskilling programs, embed My Future Jobs by Kasuma with AI and ML for vacancy matching, so that the unemployment ratio would be loosened up. Also, amend Gig Workers Act and also SOCSO Act to protect our local workers. And finally, reduce our labour market dependency on foreign labours. When we reduce it and enhance our local talent supply match, so V over U ratio would be more stable in Malaysian case. So conclusively, we say that in our research that yes, LMT is not statistically significant, CPI, GDP more significant. However, when we go deeper, we need to see that the government, especially MOHR and also Ministry of Economy and multiple stakeholders need to take into account and address LMT challenges. We acknowledge there are some data limitations focusing on this part, we can see that the quarterly wage series for 2015 to 2021 was backcasted. It is not same with 2022 onwards. So there are some data discrepancies there. Small sample size, only 44 quarters. Larger sample size, better accuracy, right? And endogeneity concerns, aggregation bias of LMD itself, and also we suggest future improvements, use higher frequency monthly data sets, not just quarterly, conduct sector specific, not just general on every labor market, but go deeper into main sectors, manufacturing, construction, etc., and apply advanced econometric techniques for better accuracy. And how do we do this? Referencing on secondary sources from DOSM, BNM, etc., more than 20 journal data point. So I think that's the end of our presentation. That's us from Labor Gang. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you.